Hello everyone, welcome to our Truth Be Told YouTube channel with your hosts Rick Howard and Mike Maney.
Hello everyone. Welcome to session number 70.
Yes.
Truth Be Told, and we wondered if we should have a special celebration or some kind of special lesson or something because of 70, because 70 is one of those important prophetic numbers in the Bible. Daniel's 70 weeks especially. And Moses selected 70 elders, and 70 is a pretty common idea in the Bible of prophetic themes. And actually the session today might feed into that a little bit, because we've been talking on recurring themes. We kind of finished the book of Exodus. So we've gone through Genesis and Exodus. And so the last few sessions we've been talking about recurring themes. Mike Maney up there in Missoula, Montana, where he is so excited because right now at 12:30, 1 o'clock your time, the middle of the day, it's 32, so it's going to be a few degrees above freezing for one of the first times in quite a while.
Yes.
He was showing me pictures of sleet and hail and snow and all sorts of things they faced lately. But you have nothing on us, Mike. I mean, the last few days here, today is March 1st, 2023. We've had 2 or 3 straight days of storms coming through that were, for us, really cold. So tons of snow on the mountains, several feet every day for several days.
Wow.
Whiteout conditions, blizzards. You look at pictures of people's cars and homes up in the mountains, and the snow's up to the peak of the real steep roof that they build up there for the snow.
Oh, wow. Wow.
It shows a car, the snow's like 10 times higher than their car, things like that. It's just amazing. So it's been that kind of year for us. And so I figure with all this extra snow, extra rain, we've had a really good wet winter so far. Lots of snow built up for coming down the mountains into the reservoirs later this spring, that it's probably only going to take us about 1, maybe 2 years before they declare a severe drought again in California. So we have many cycles of wet, and for some reason we turn back to drought pretty quick, because we have a lot of little critters in the rivers and streams flowing out to the ocean that some of them might die if we don't keep those full enough of water runoff, so we can't save it for ourselves.
Well, I'll tell you what, speaking of reoccurring, you need a greater reoccurring of politicians there in Sacramento.
Yeah, let's not get on that.
Speaking of critters.
Yes. So these recurring themes we've dealt with the last few sessions, I wanted to continue that. I mentioned a few sessions ago one that I've been developing, and you said you were going to hold me to it. So I've kind of developed some thoughts, and some of this we've dealt with before based on Genesis 3:15, that key early prophecy of the 2 seeds and the conflict between them and the individual representatives of those 2 seeds along through history, culminating in the last 2 great seeds, the godly seed and the ungodly, of Christ and antichrist, and of their people, of their corporate group. And the antichrist and his people are going to be trying to slaughter the seed of God, both the nation of Israel and the church. And then, of course, Christ steps in at just the right time, as he always does. But I wanted to develop this idea as it works itself out through Genesis and Exodus and the rest of the Bible. And again, we've dealt with parts of this in past sessions, but we've never devoted a complete session to this repeated theme that is a really, really important one to see all the way through the Bible. Because what starts in Genesis 3:15 is not resolved until Revelation 19, and even a little bit later, at the end of the 1,000 years. But Genesis 3:15 is working itself out in both individuals and in what we might call people groups, nations and empires, and even holy nations. And so let's read Genesis 3:15. Welcome, everybody. I hope I spur some thoughts as I go through this today. And of course, this is God talking directly to the serpent. Of course, the power behind the serpent being Satan himself. And he says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. So there's individual, you and the woman. There's corporate, your seed and her seed. And then a representative from that will eventually, he shall bruise your head, a death blow, a fatal blow, and you shall bruise his heel, which we would say the Bible ends up describing this as an ongoing bruising of the heel of, where does a snake normally bite a person? In the heel and in the foot, in the leg, lower down. Sometimes they're able to go up higher. And and when throughout history, you're out on the farm walking through the forest or tall grass or something, and a snake bites you, especially if you have your children with you or your wife with you or something, even though that snake bite might be fatal to you, or at least make you sick, bring quite a bit of pain and suffering and so forth. But if you have your mind about you, what do you immediately try to do? Well, if you have boots on, you stomp that serpent on the head, kill it. So it has bit you in the heel and it causes pain and suffering. But you stomp it on the head and crush its head and kill it. And so that's the analogy that God is trying to draw here, of that you may strike the heel of the woman and her seed often throughout history, and it's going to bring a lot of pain and suffering. But there will come one eventually that will crush your head and destroy you. And so it's a wonderful initial prophecy. We call it the Proto-Evangel, the initial first gospel message, because it's a message of even though there's ongoing conflict, and when we say ongoing conflict, it looks like often that the seed of the serpent is winning and in control and the most powerful and dominant, and that the woman and the seed of the woman is almost destroyed, at least in servitude, a prisoner, exile, on the run, in a weakened position. And what I want to show, even though most of our viewers and listeners are quite familiar with this verse and think maybe there's nothing new under the sun to say about it, I think there's a lot more to say about it, maybe that even you and I have not brought out in past sessions. And how I'd like to develop this is to set it up this way. The Bible, Jesus said, the kingdom, especially the subject of the kingdom, but the whole Bible, we would say, is like a man who pulls out of his treasures those both old and new. And the Bible remains so fresh and so new. Not that there's anything in it new, but there are things newly revealed to us, or they take on an added emphasis to us that maybe they had not in the past. And it keeps us studying. The last few Sundays, my sermons at Liberty has been just very familiar Bible stories. Zacchaeus one week, and then the Syrophoenician woman last Sunday. Just stories that are quite familiar that I have really, really, really enjoyed going back and looking at them again, and maybe bringing out some things that I've never brought out before. The Bible is like that. It's always to be new and fresh to us, like a drink of cool water on a hot day, or like, because we're still in stormy, cold weather in both of our places, like the hot cup of coffee that we're drinking in our offices. And how I'd like to do that is look at, it's always fascinated me when Moses was writing the book of Genesis, and of course by inspiration, but it's obvious that he was racing to get to the story of Abraham as fast as possible. And so once you have initial creation and the sin of Adam and Eve and sin coming into the picture, so by then you're to chapter 4, and by chapter 11, Abram is brought into the picture. So you have very few chapters dealing with the first 2,000 years of history. And then by chapter 11, he like puts on the brakes, and the rest of the Old Testament is then dealing with the next 2,000 years. So you just have a very few chapters dealing with such a long period of time. What would you want to deal with in those 2,000 years to bring? And of course, the purpose of Moses for Israel out there in the wilderness is to just give them a bit of context leading up to Abraham, and then develop that in more detail. And so he chose, after initial creation and the fall into sin, he chose the story of Cain and Abel, and then he chose the story of the flood, and then he chose the story of Nimrod and the Tower of Babel. And we're all very familiar with those stories. We've preached and taught on them a lot, but I've never forced myself, I guess, or allowed myself to put those three stories in the context of Genesis 3:15. By that I mean, I think one reason why God led Moses to select those three stories, of course they were all major stories, is that he gives us so very important of a prophecy of how things will be worked out in the future. And then if you look at these three stories as three examples of that, in other words, I'm giving this very important prophecy. Adam and Eve heard him say this to the serpent. Maybe God even explained it more completely to them. But overall, they did understand at least that there's going to be a seed, both godly and ungodly, and there's going to be ongoing conflict, and there's going to be ultimate victory of the godly seed, the seed of the woman, over the seed of the serpent. So they understood at least those principles to some degree. And so when we come to the story of Cain and Abel, and when it says in chapter 4 and verse 1, Adam knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, and said, I have acquired a man from the Lord. So once again, I went back into different translations. I went back into the Hebrew language. I went back into interpretations of Hebrew scholars of that verse, because I've heard this in the past. I wanted to make sure I wasn't just thinking this up on my own or imagining it. But a number of Hebrew scholars say that in the Hebrew language, the idea of I have acquired a man from the Lord, that Hebrew language is not always real precise. And in some translations, the word from is in italics. And some translations actually say, I have acquired or gained a man, the Lord. And so it's caused some to wonder, and I've wondered myself. When God gave that promise and said that the seed of the woman is going to crush the head of the serpent and gain the victory, by the time Cain and Abel were born, Adam and Eve began to understand the depth of the damage that bringing sin into the world was causing. And they were experiencing to some degree the negative results of all of that, especially as they compared it to their time in the Garden of Eden before sin, and how different life was now, and how much more difficult and sorrow and pain was added into the life experience, that we don't know how much time passed before Cain was born, but enough time so that the reality of their sin and its results were being understood. And so when she had Cain, it is possible that at least maybe she wondered, is this the man, the seed of the woman? I'm the woman. Here's my seed. Is this the seed that's going to crush the head of the serpent? Is this the one to gain the victory? And I don't want to press this too much because, she may have just really said, I have acquired a man from the Lord. But there seems to be something deeper there. And in context of 3:15, she may well have wondered. I mean, we talk about how that once the promise of a Messiah figure was well understood within God's people, Israel, and the uncertainty of when that might happen, that every Jewish virgin girl wondered if she would be the one to bring forth that blessed baby from a virgin girl. And I think the same mindset may have been involved in Eve, where she had heard the promise that a seed from the woman, and she was the only woman around at that time, that if this might be the one who would accomplish that victory, because they didn't know, and God purposely didn't tell them that this is way out there in the distant future. As far as they knew, it could be within their lifetime. It could be within their son. It could be within their short life experience of evil and sin that had come into the world. And so she named him the name that kind of carries this idea. And the reason I'm kind of expanding on that a little bit, it'd be natural for them to at least wish this were so, or wondered if it was so. Not so much that they thought for sure it was so, but the possibility or the question may have arisen in their minds, that is this the one? And again, the reason I'm pressing it so much is because not only were they wrong, they were dead wrong. They didn't know that their heartaches had just begun. And so the story of Cain and Abel is an example right away of what Genesis 3:15 means. The first example of the struggle between the two seeds. And that's what Cain and Abel is. We know Adam and Eve had many other children, they had daughters and sons, but we're only told about 3 of them, at least here in this setting, because they represent the first example of the outworking of what God meant in Genesis 3:15. So, of course, then Abel came along, and they clashed. And Abel didn't so much clash with Cain, but Cain clashed with Abel. Abel did nothing wrong to deserve his death, his murder. It was all on Cain. Mm-hmm. But the story of Cain, like in verse 5, he did not respect Cain and his offering, and Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. So this is a description of the representative of the seed of the serpent, full of anger, full of downcast, full of not accepting blame, but blaming someone else, and striking out after an innocent person who had done nothing wrong. Mm-hmm. All of those are descriptions of the seed of the serpent, and that's found in Cain. And so, of course, he kills his brother. And I know some of what I'm saying on this is conjecture, but I don't think it's too much. When God said to Cain in verse 10, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." What does that tell us? Well, it tells us there was more than just a little bit of blood. There was a lot of blood. And most believe, and I agree with this, that the way that Cain killed Abel was probably out there in the field. He just picked up a big rock and bashed Abel's head in. That would produce a lot of blood, and that would be the kind of single blow that would be fatal. And the reason I'm drawing that picture is so the way Cain killed Abel brings in right away the solution to the problem of Genesis 3:15, but just in an opposite way, an evil way. In other words, a stone striking a head blow, crushing the skull, bringing lots of blood, and bringing death. Of course, the stone, the rock, is an early picture of Christ, and he will crush the head of the serpent with himself and bring about the destruction. Let me see if I can explain this, how it's kind of in my mind. This is the seed of the serpent, not biting the heel of the seed of the woman, but crushing the head of the seed of the woman, which is opposite of the prophecy of 3:15. Mm-hmm. From that, I'm thinking right away, Satan, human nature, sin, working itself in this seed of the serpent, Cain, by purposely striking his brother with a rock on the head, shedding blood and causing death, is an attempt, at least in appearance, to say, I can overcome your promise and prophecy of 3:15. I can do to the godly seed what you say the godly seed is going to do to me. And by doing so, making it appear that God's promise is not faithful to his ability to bring it about, that the seed of the serpent is able to overcome the promise to the seed of the woman. And therefore, Cain kills Abel in the same way that the eventual seed of the woman is going to kill the seed of the serpent, Christ and Antichrist.
Almost as if Satan is
explaining that in a way that makes it clear what I'm trying to get across.
Yeah. So behind the scenes, the influence of Satan through Cain is making a statement in defiance of this prophecy.
I can defy God's promises and prophecy, and I'm going to show it by turning that promise around and doing to him what is said is going to be done to me.
Mm-hmm.
I think it fits.
Yeah, I've never thought of that before, but you're right. I mean, Satan's all about defeating God. He wanted to be like God, and so in that effort, you first of all have to discredit God
Mm-hmm.
and His word and His promises.
Your promise is not sure, like you want people
Yes.
to believe.
Yes.
I can overcome it. I can defeat it. I can defy it.
Yeah.
I can even fulfill it in the opposite way you
Mm-hmm.
said it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
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 And so it adds an element to the story of Cain and Abel that fits it in the context of 3:15 in a way that, as you and I so often try to do, we're trying to show the unity and harmony of the whole Bible. And so God gives a graphic, dramatic example right away of how 3:15 is going to be worked out through history over and over and over again.
Yeah. Yeah. And the warning there in 3:15, just how powerful that forecast or warning is going to play out, is a very powerful evil force that they set in motion. And like you said earlier, they didn't realize just how this would happen or the effects of it, but they're seeing it in their two sons. One is dead and one becomes cursed. So they're feeling it now.
Of course, Adam and Eve know when all this happened. One son was murdered and the other son murdered him.
Mm-hmm.
They only thought, when Cain was born, they only thought that they understood what sin coming into creation was, the heartache and the pain and the suffering and the sweat and the everything, because they'd no doubt experienced some of that before Cain and Abel was born. But they only thought they knew the extent of it. Mm-hmm. Now, after this, their heart is broken because they knew we caused this.
Mm-hmm.
And then they understand better why God rejected them covering themselves with fig leaves, and he insisted on the shedding of innocent blood to forgive sins and to cover their sins. And isn't it interesting? Again, Satan working through Cain, God showing in 3:21, no, it takes the shedding of innocent blood and it takes me covering you, not yourself. That this is part of the story of Cain and Abel, where Cain says, I'll show you what shedding innocent blood is all about. And he shed innocent blood when he killed his brother Abel. So this whole story is a story of defiance against God's proclamations in 3:15 and 3:21. This is basically Satan saying, I can overcome all of that. But to close the loop, and here's the blessing in all this. In 4:25, the birth of Seth, and of course the meaning of Seth, that it says God has appointed another seed for me instead of Abel, whom Cain killed. So it closes the loop. It's basically God saying to Satan and to the seed of the serpent, you think I cannot keep my promises? You think that I'm not faithful to my word? Ever how many times you try to crush the head of Abel, I will raise up another godly seed, because I will have a godly seed that will crush his head one day. And so Seth is a picture of the substitute idea of Christ, because Christ took the place of all of us. All of us deserved to die like Abel. Abel didn't deserve to die, but all of us deserve death. And Seth is the Christ figure, shows us that God will always raise up a replacement. He will always have an elect remnant, a godly seed, that the Cains of history will never be able to completely wipe out the seed of the woman. It will look like it. When Cain killed Abel, it looked like the seed of the serpent had completely destroyed the seed of the woman. God says, oh yeah, you only think so. Here's Seth. And as many Cains as you try to kill, I'll raise up another Seth, as I will have the victory one day. So God raises up a replacement until one comes along, of course, Christ, to take the place of all of us. So, you know, as ugly and terrible as this story in Genesis 4 is, it's the gospel story in a graphic, dramatic picture of God guaranteeing that 3:15 is still in place even after Cain killed Abel. It's still there. I'll show you. Here's Seth.
You know, I think, Brother Rick, what we're seeing is that, and I used the word tension last time, this tension between God and Lucifer that was, first of all, limited to heaven. And the tension got so great and his pride became so strong that he rebelled. So there's your first indication of tension. Then he brings that tension down to the earth through the human pair, and just really is showcasing his power. And so the power, Jesus recognized this tension between Satan and, you know, even himself, and what he started his church, because he said the gates of hell will not prevail against my church. So he's recognizing this ongoing tension. It's not going to let up. It's going to be all throughout these 2,000 years, which of course we have observed, you know, but you're right. God is going to rise above it, as he always does. And that's the day we are praying for and looking forward to.
Well, even you bring up Matthew 16:18, even that is a reflection of the outworking of Genesis 3:15.
Yes, it is.
I'd never thought about this before. Matthew 16:18 in light of Genesis 3:15, because when he says the gates of hell shall not prevail, okay, there's the ultimate victory. But it also means, and we don't normally like to bring up this part, but it also means the gates of hell will try to destroy her. Over and over again. So there's the seed of the serpent trying to destroy the seed of the woman. It will not be successful completely, but it will appear successful many times. And so Christ is given the assurance, basically when he says the gates of hell shall not prevail, is just kind of another way of saying the seed of the woman will bruise the head of the seed of the serpent. The ultimate victory of God in his seed. So I think I said this in earlier sessions, but it bears repeating, because a lot of fairy tale stories, children's stories, a lot of them are based in truth. They're just made a little different form. And from this story of Genesis 3:15 and the outworking of it in Genesis 4 is where we get all these stories. They're in every culture, all through history, these kind of stories of a dragon trying to kill, or at least control as a prisoner. It's always a fair damsel, isn't it? A woman in distress. So this woman in Genesis 3:15, when Cain and Abel were born in chapter 4, verse 1 and 2, she was the only woman. So that was the only woman that could apply to. But that woman in Genesis 3:15 is Eve, but not just Eve. It's Sarah, but not just Sarah. It's Mary, but not just Mary. It's the woman is the one producing the godly seed over and over again, and the serpent is constantly after. So from that idea comes all of these stories in every culture of this dragon trying to kill her, have as a prisoner, either in an underground cave, as a lot of them, or up in a high tower behind bars is another version of it. Sometimes the dragon breathes fire, sometimes he can fly. There's all different little versions of it, but all is from the same source.
Yes.
And this dragon, for some reason, you think, why would a dragon want a treasure? But there's always like this pile of gold or this huge treasure that the dragon's trying to capture. You think, well, why would a dragon want a treasure? But it fits in the Bible story, isn't it? That Satan's wanting to control the treasure that belongs to God, and he's trying to destroy the fair damsel in distress. And when it looks like he has control of that treasure and that woman, and she's a prisoner or on the verge of death, at that last moment, a knight in shining armor, that white knight or whatever, the hero of the story, risks his life. He's always like on the verge of being killed by the dragon. You know, he has his little sword in his hand, and here's this huge dragon breathing fire.
Yeah.
He has no chance against that dragon. But he risks his life to save that damsel in distress. He kills the dragon. He gathers the treasure unto himself. He marries the woman, and they live happily ever after. Well, okay, we say those are fairy tales or fables or what, but it's in every culture, and it's based on something somewhere. And I think it's based on Genesis 3:15. And
well, even Hollywood. I mean, basically, in a broader scope, we're talking good versus evil, and the movies are based on this. There's villains,
aren't they?
And not only that, but cartoons. I remember watching. I forget the hero's name. Dudley Do-Right, I think it was, and Snidely Whiplash, and the damsel is tied on the tracks
every time.
Every time.
And he barely rescues her at the last second.
Yes, right. So even cartoons, you're right. Nursery rhymes were often, what's the word I want? They were speaking of an actual, maybe a political figure, maybe a king or something. But they were speaking of the times. Okay, so they were couched in the way that in a children's nursery rhyme, but they really were pointing to something of reality. And so, yeah, this is what classic good versus evil is all built around the scriptures and this Genesis 3:15 and what you're talking about here.
So that's the first major example of Genesis 3:15, how it's going to be worked out. The second major example is the flood. And so, we love to talk about the flood and the ark and God sparing their family and all that. But again, I'm trying to put it in the context of 3:15, where it describes it's almost like when Cain killed Abel, just before the flood, almost total victory of evil over good.
Yeah.
Down to one family. Until and everybody thought he was crazy. And until God stepped in and showed to what extreme measure he will do to keep Genesis 3:15 alive.
Yeah.
One family. And we don't even know. I mean, he spared the whole family. We're really not told the spiritual condition of his wife and his three sons and their wives. I'd like to think they were godly helpers of him. But we're just really not told. All we're really told is Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And part of the reason for the flood, as I like to bring out, is God shows the extreme he'll go to save his institutions. In this case, the family. He will destroy the whole world to save one family, because God's institutions are perpetual, all of them. And when he started the family in the Garden of Eden with marriage and gave them children, he was promising their perpetuity. And so it took something like the flood for him to keep his promise of preserving the family unit and of preserving a godly seed. And so I don't want to take time to go over. We went over the flood before, and very familiar story, but I do want to go over to chapter 8 of Genesis, and right after the flood, verse 14. In the second month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dried. Then God spoke to Noah, saying, "Go out of the ark, you and your wife, your sons' wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing of all flesh that is with you, birds and cattle, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, that they may abound on the earth, be fruitful and multiply on the earth. So he's starting over again. So Noah went out. So let's just stop there. Noah went out. You think Noah, at this point, knowing that everybody on earth had died, nothing had lived, no one had lived except those in the ark, had a sense of the truth of what God meant in Genesis 3:15, that the seed of the woman, no matter how bad it looks, will ultimately prevail over the seed of the serpent. Even though it seemed impossible how that would happen, God sent something so major as the flood to emphasize, yeah, I really meant what I said in Genesis 3:15. It's going to look really, really, really bad at times, but I've always got a way to keep that promise moving forward. And of course, we know that once Christ died and rose again, that guaranteed it from that point on. But it was already guaranteed when God said it in Genesis 3:15, but it was sealed by the cross and resurrection. And then the third main story that is an example of how 3:15 will be worked out is Nimrod and the Tower of Babel. Nimrod is one of the big or large, clear types of antichrist. So all along, this seed of the serpent is both in corporate form, a group, people group, but usually there is an individual that's kind of like a tyrant or something on that level that represents them. And Nimrod, of course, founded Nineveh and Babylon, which later those two people groups were the ones who took Israel and Judah into captivity. And so they find their roots back with Nimrod. And so you have this Antichrist figure and the people, the seed that develops from him, later taking the seed of Abraham into captivity and appearing like what Nimrod had started way back there had won the victory. And they were removed from their land. They became slaves. They were scattered, persecuted, killed. And so God's answer to Nimrod and Babel, okay, how does he say the promise is going to continue? If we look at chapter 11, I want to read just verse 30, because this gives the stark answer in not so hopeful terms. But Sarah was barren. She had no child. So God says the answer to the threat of Nimrod, the Tower of Babel, and this group, corporate, prideful, rebellious attitude toward me, the answer is an old woman who's barren. That's the answer. So you look at that and you think, that doesn't look like much of an answer to me.
Right. Yeah.
And
So I was just thinking, Brother Rick, in that promise, back to Genesis 3:15, in that promise, God had vowed himself to work through a human instrument. The promise was, I'm going to work this out, and it's going to be through humans. And so back to your statement of Genesis 8, down to one human family, but he didn't abandon that promise. He's going to work it out through humans. And you mentioned Babylon and Nineveh. In this ongoing back and forth tension between God and Satan, it was raised up with defiance and rebellion through Nineveh. But then there's one point in their history where God sends Jonah
Mhm.
in an attempt to rescue them. So this back and forth effort to save or to destroy, God on one side of the ring and Satan in the other corner of the ring, just continually battling it out for people, for humanity.
Yes, yeah, that's good. That's a good point. So I went through all that to mainly just show, kind of in summary, that Moses, by direction of the Spirit, of course, chose three main stories to show how 315 works itself out over the first 2,000 years of history.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one reason why God directed him to do that, because of course Moses wrote those stories and no doubt recited them and had copies made and all of that to a people who had just left Egypt, because Egypt and Pharaoh were another great example of 315, and they were living it.
Mm-hmm.
So he's letting them know, you're not the first ones to live this out. I'm going to give you three earlier examples of how it's been worked out all along.
Mm-hmm.
What the New Testament ends up calling the mystery of iniquity and the mystery of godliness.
Mm-hmm.
Just another way of saying the seed of the serpent, the seed of the woman. How they're going to work themselves out in repeated fashion
Mm-hmm.
all through history. And most of the time, it will appear the mystery of iniquity has won the victory. But God always, we can always have confidence in God of his faithfulness and ability to bring about his promises. And so the context for the people Moses was writing these for was the newly delivered nation of Israel out of Egypt, and how that they had just lived a Genesis 3:15 experience.
Mm-hmm.
And how that even in the birth of Moses, how that this Pharaoh, this antichrist figure, this
Mm-hmm.
seed of the serpent figure, had tried to wipe out really the whole nation by wiping out all the male babies.
Mm-hmm.
And how that God overcame that by a woman and her female daughter,
Mm-hmm.
hiding that baby boy, or putting that baby boy
Mm-hmm.
in that little ark, pushing him away, pushing him into the providence of God.
Mm-hmm.
And we know the story of Moses. So this woman idea is repeated often. And this woman story is repeated in the story of Rahab the harlot,
Mm-hmm.
a Gentile harlot woman in Jericho.
Mm-hmm.
And who was her son, according to Matthew 1? One of the most
Boaz.
godly men who ever lived,
Mm-hmm.
Boaz.
Mm-hmm.
So all of these are just kind of repetitious of a similar theme
Mm-hmm.
of God emphasizing, just kind of keeping
Mm-hmm.
hope alive. I have not forgotten Genesis 3:15. There's always going to be a seed of a woman. It's a godly seed. And finally, I'm going to bring the ultimate seed to a woman who's a virgin without any human help at all.
Mm-hmm.
She's going to have the ultimate seed to bring about the ultimate victory.
Mm-hmm.
So we could repeat these stories over and over again all the way through the Old Testament. One of the great examples of it, of course, is David and Goliath. I mean, that's one of the most well-known, but really clearest, I guess I would say,
Mm-hmm.
pictures of the two representatives of the two seeds. It appeared David had no chance, of course. And the means of his victory was not by putting on Saul's armor, the works of man. The means of his victory was a stone to the head. That sound like Genesis 3:15?
Yeah.
The
Yes.
stone being Christ,
Yes.
crushing the head of the seed of the serpent. And of course, Goliath is a great picture of antichrist, giant, powerful, strong, mocking David. You've sent me a little kid. How dare you? I'm going to wipe the floor with him.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and David with that stone picture of, and then it says, I want to go over and read this. We're so familiar, so I'm not going to take a lot of time, but 1 Samuel 17, I'm going to share a particular blessing with you. I think I had heard this at one time early in my ministry, or maybe come across it or thought of it or something. But a few years ago, we were at a meeting in Tulare, Bible meeting, and Braden Barnum asked me a question. He said, over there in 1 Samuel 17:54, after David cut off the head of Goliath, what did he bring it to Jerusalem? What was the purpose of that? They didn't control Jerusalem yet or anything. And I really didn't have a good answer for him. We were kind of talking about it and everything. And then this aged, infirmed, just a few years before his death, man walks in the building, Brother Worski. And so we said, hey, let's ask him if he has an opinion on it. And so, Brother Worski, have you ever thought about that? His face brightened up, twinkle in his eye, it's just like he was 50 years younger all of a sudden. He goes, oh, yes. He says, that's a beautiful story. He says, why did he take the head that represented the seed of the serpent and David, representative of Christ, and killed him with a stone blow to the head, and all the symbols and pictures, spiritual pictures, all of that draws. Why did he take him to Jerusalem? Well, he said, first of all, it's going to be the capital city of the seed of David, where the throne is going to be. But he said, have you ever connected it to and wondered why John 19:17 calls Mount Calvary, instead calls it Golgotha, the place of the skull. And it's like all of a sudden a light bulb goes off in all of us, because we're told in a lot of dictionaries and things that it looked like a skull looking at the side of that mountain or something like that. But Brother Worski said, have you ever considered that from that point on, the place where David buried the skull, that crushed head, seed of the serpent Goliath, that they called that from that point on the place of the skull? Because when David finally captured Jerusalem and made it the capital, he knew exactly where that skull was buried. And so how would he identify that place? Well, that's the place of the skull.
A standing monument to the victory.
A standing monument of God giving them the great victory over the Philistines and Goliath, and the representative of that seed of the serpent. And, here was this aged man who just had this simple answer that just seemed so clear and obvious to us when he said it.
Just waiting for some young preacher to ask that question. I was thinking, Brother Rick, back to the garden and to the tree in the fall. The tree of knowledge, it was the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And little did Eve realize what she was unleashing on the rest of us. And you mentioned that this ongoing struggle, in the New Testament, it becomes known as the mystery of godliness and the mystery of iniquity. And so it's changed names, but our knowledge and awareness of this good and evil, this whole struggle, has certainly increased. when with every generation we're seeing it increasing. So our awareness of it is clear and
Yes.
growing more clear. Our obligation is to, okay, what do we do with this knowledge? Are we going to cling to the promise that God will ultimately win, or are we just going to throw our hands up and just not care, not even step into the ring? But we're obligated to take this knowledge that we've been given now, some 4,000 years later, and make sure that it not only shapes our lives, but as we teach and train others, make sure they're well aware of this ongoing conflict too, the tree of knowledge of good and evil.
Mm-hmm. So this place where David buried Goliath's skull, the place of the skull in Jerusalem, and how David represents so clearly the greater David, son of David, and makes Jerusalem his capital. It's going to be the capital of the kingdom of Christ. And so is it any wonder that this is the place where the two final seeds will have their final conflict, is Jerusalem.
Yep.
And it's interesting that Zechariah 14:2, we like to quote, I will gather all nations to battle. And it doesn't say at Jerusalem. That's kind of how we read it. It's against Jerusalem. Against. This is the two representative seeds, Christ and Antichrist, and their people gathered together, and the seed of the serpent is making one last major attempt against what Psalm 48:2 calls the city of the great king. And that's not just talking about David, that's talking about the greater David.
Yeah.
He's wanting to control the city of the great king. And Christ comes back and says, not so fast.
Yeah.
And that's the reason that it's there at Jerusalem, but it's against Jerusalem. And Daniel 11:45, that just before the Antichrist is destroyed, that whole chapter talking a lot about the Antichrist. And it says in Daniel 11:45, and he, this is the Antichrist, shall plant the tents of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. That's between the Sea of Galilee and the Mediterranean Sea and the city of Jerusalem. So he's coming down to capture Jerusalem. And that's why God's going to gather all the nations against Jerusalem, because he's going to make sure that at the time of his return to destroy that seed of the serpent, or that sword that goes out of his mouth, that representatives of the whole world are going to be there to see it. And so there'll be no denying it. There'll be no changing the story. And it's when he does this, and he's right there on the verge of capturing Jerusalem, maybe he does for a short time, yet he shall come to his end, and no one will help him. So this seed of the serpent has had many, many, many helpers.
Yes.
Millions down through history, including total empires. But when he comes to his end, evidently, no one is either going to be willing or able to come help him. He's going to be all on his own. And Revelation describes it as they're going to capture him alive, throw him alive into the lake of fire. So what a dramatic picture to the nations on the earth at that time, where this one that they have followed and allowed him to dictate to them for at least 3.5 years, is seen thrown into the lake of fire alive. What an impression that'll make.
Back to Jerusalem, even at the end of the 1,000 years, as soon as Satan is released, he heads straight for Jerusalem. to encompass
He
that.
does, doesn't he? He goes to the city to surround it.
And I'm thinking, what is his interest in Jerusalem? I don't know that, and this is what we're talking about, this strain between good and evil and God and Satan. I don't know that it's Jerusalem per se that he's interested in. It could maybe perhaps be any city, but Jerusalem just so happened to be the city that God put his name there.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really an attack against God again, because God placed his name there and has expressed his love for that city. That's what is drawing the interest by Satan. That's all he cares about, is just attacking God and destroying his name. And so that's where he heads right after
and
1,000 years.
You really swerved us into the subject of election, which is such a subject in the Bible. Psalm number 2, why do the nations rage? And the peoples imagine a vain thing. They have said, let us, against his anointed, against his king. 2:6 says, I have set my king on my holy hill of Zion. So God has made some choices about who will be king, where he will be king, over whom he will be king. And the raging is because people, of course, Satan ultimately, the antichrist ultimately, reject God's choices, God's election. That's why Israel has had such a hard time in her history, not just because of her disobedience, but because of the jealousy and hatred against God choosing Isaac and not Ishmael, Jacob and not Esau, Judah and Joseph, not Reuben and Simeon. And then the church of our day is God's elect. And why have the Anabaptists had such a difficult time through history? Because the established state church, the church of man, the church established by humans, the perverted form of Christianity, hates God's choice, because God's choice doesn't always look impressive. Fishermen and tax collectors.
Right.
He didn't choose the elite scribes and Pharisees from Jerusalem and the temple. He chose those we would not choose.
Right.
So that all the glory would go to him and not to impressive credentials and elitism of humans, because we are so easily lifted in pride. And so that's what the mighty Saul of Tarsus had to learn when he wrote 1 Corinthians. God has chosen, the foolish things of this world to confound the wise, and the poor things confound the rich, and that no flesh should glory in his presence, but all the glory should go to Christ. And that's what we're talking about, really, in all of this, is God's right to choose and man's rejection of God's choices and his rebellion against it, even trying to destroy and overthrow God's choices. I mean, the classic example of that is a story of Esther and Mordecai and Haman.
Yes.
And it looked like at one point that Haman was going to accomplish the destruction of the Jews. But it did not happen. In fact, as we like to say with a smile on our face, he was hung on his own gallows, because that's what's going to happen in essence to Antichrist. So just many, people watching this or listening to this can take what we've put out there today and choose different examples in the Bible, because there's plenty to choose from of how this has worked out all through history. But I wanted to try to start tying this together a little bit in a verse in Ezekiel 38. And because this ties so much together what I've been trying to say. Ezekiel 38 and verse 17. This is about Gog, who is just another name for Antichrist. 38:17. Thus says the Lord God, are you he of whom I have spoken in former days by my servants, the prophets of Israel, who prophesied for years in those days that I would bring you against them. One reason why this verse is so important is God is telling us, I have spoken about this man and this seed of the serpent a lot, and a lot more than we realize, a lot more than we have time to bring out today, a lot more than you and I even know. That one of the things he's going to reveal to us at his return is how often this evil figure, either in types and shadows or in direct prophecies, is all through the Old Testament. There's many, many places, much more than we know, of individuals and entire corporate examples of Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia. Can you put on pause real quick? I've got to take care of my dog. So I guess my point in Ezekiel 38:17, there, instead of reading a lot of verses, I think, that have reference to the Antichrist, this is not really a session on just the Antichrist himself, but on the outworking of Genesis 3:15. But I just encourage all of you to give more weight to Ezekiel 38:17 and realize how what God is saying is that this seed of the serpent alongside the seed of the woman is all through the Old Testament. And one reason I bring that up is because that's one reason why in this prophecy of the 70 weeks, and today is our 70th session, and really a lot of what we've talked about has to do with those two princes mentioned in the prophecy of the 70 weeks of Daniel. And that's one reason why I have two princes in that prophecy. A lot of people try to just make it only of Christ, the Messiah prince, that him ending the sacrifice and so forth is all about Christ on the cross. But I think if we put Daniel's prophecy in context of Genesis 3:15 and all the many verses between there and Daniel, where God leads Ezekiel, his contemporary, to say, I've been talking about this guy all along. You need to pay attention. So that just lends itself to me saying these two princes are just a continuation of the two representative seeds of the serpent and the woman. And so it's a good prince and an evil prince in Daniel's prophecy of the 70 weeks. So if it, in context, I think it fits better overall than trying to say it's only speaking of Christ and not Antichrist. Because that's such an important prophecy. It has so much to do with the future. That is, I think it's talking about rulers or princes of the godly seed and the ungodly seed both in that prophecy. So take that for what you will, those of you watching this. I kind of want to close out by going to 2 Thessalonians 2. And one thing we haven't brought out a lot, but the idea of Antichrist being anti, meaning not just against, like he brings them against Jerusalem, he's against Christ, he's against God's people. All of that is true, but it also carries the idea of false or imitation or counterfeit. And so an interesting study to do sometime is in how many ways will Antichrist try to imitate the real Christ. When Lucifer said, I will be like God, many people think, and I tend to agree, that he wasn't trying to necessarily replace God, but who is like God except the Son of God? And so in essence, Satan, Lucifer, was jealous of the place of Christ to the Father. He wanted that position. He wanted no one to have greater honor in the eyes of God the Father than himself, and in what we later call Christ or Jesus, God the Son, had that position that Lucifer wanted. And so the outworking of the Antichrist, as we'll see, is through the power of Satan, the working of Satan. So that same desire is still there. The Antichrist wants the position of Christ. That's why he wants to capture Jerusalem, the city of Christ. And one way he's going to counterfeit that, I don't know if you ever thought about this before, when it says in 2 Thessalonians 2, at the end of verse 4, which is really describing what the abomination of desolation is all about. The first half of that verse describes the frame of mind that causes that abomination. He opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshiped. But have you ever thought about this part? So that he sits as God in the temple of God. He sits as God in the temple of God. And I've never connected this before to Psalm 110, verse 1, where God said to his Son, after the death and resurrection and ascension, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. So what in essence is Antichrist doing sitting in the temple of God? He's trying to imitate or counterfeit the idea of Christ sitting at the right hand of the Father, coming back to be king over all the earth. It's kind of a defiant way of showing, no, I'm taking that position unto myself. This idea of sitting in this important place. I don't want to make too much of it, but just the idea of both are sitting in such a prominent place, it shows this long desire of wanting to have the place of Christ.
Well, I think it goes back to, again, Cain and Abel, the struggle that Cain had toward Abel. Abel didn't have the struggle toward Cain. It was Cain against Abel.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you look at these two brothers in that light of Jesus and Lucifer, as it were, and this struggle that Lucifer has against Christ, against the Son of God. And so he, like you said, he wants to be that Son of God. He wants to be that favorite son.
And so at this moment in 2:4, 2 Thessalonians 2:4, at that moment, it's almost as if he's declaring, I have overcome Genesis 3:15.
Mm-hmm.
Because at that point, it will appear that he is invincible.
Mm-hmm.
He will have had his own death and resurrection event of some type. He will be incarnated by Lucifer, who's cast out in Revelation 12. And the world will look at him at that point, whatever transition or transformation happens in him in the middle of that 70th week, to where the nations will be forced to say, who can make war against him? He will seem invincible. So this act of sitting in the temple is kind of his defiant way of saying Genesis 3:15 has finally been overcome. It appears that God cannot keep his promise, that I am in control of God's creation and nothing can stop me. And it's going to take 3.5 more years before God's going to show him otherwise. I want to close by looking at in chapter 2, verse 8 of 2 Thessalonians, which, by the way, Paul is quoting Isaiah 11:4. So if you look at Isaiah 11:4 and not know it, you wouldn't know that that's talking about the antichrist. But that's one good example of how, when God said through Ezekiel, "Are you he of whom my prophets have spoken often about, who would come against my people?" Verses like Isaiah 11:4 lets us know it's in there a lot more than we know when we first read that passage. Can you read Isaiah 11:4?
Yeah, we jump over there. Isaiah 11:4 in the New King James.
Yes.
Okay. But with righteousness he shall judge the poor and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. He shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall slay the wicked.
Now, slay the wicked seems like a generic statement, but another possible way to translate that from Hebrew is he shall slay the wicked one, meaning the Antichrist.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that's the correct translation of that from Paul's quote of that, applying it directly to the wicked one, the Antichrist. And so 2:8 of 2 Thessalonians is quoting Isaiah 11:4, and then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will consume with the breath of his mouth and destroy with the brightness of his coming. Just a rewording of Isaiah 11:4, applying it to Antichrist. Now, one thing that doesn't, I want to close with this thought, because this closes this big circle we've been involved in today, back to Genesis 3:15, and this seed of the serpent, seed of the woman, side by side, and how that God will get the ultimate victory, is found here, but it's not real evident in the English translation. But in verse 9 of 2 Thessalonians 2, the coming of the lawless one is according to the working. Let me see, I have my interlinear here. Verse 9, according to the interlinear says operation instead of working. But it's the Greek word energia, if you want to pronounce it with a hard or soft G. We get energy from that. It's translated most often in the New Testament, the working or operation, energia. So the coming of the Antichrist is according to the energia of Satan. Then if you go down to verse 11, in our English translations, it says, "And for this reason God will send them strong delusion, that they should believe the lie." But actually the word translated strong in our English translations is the word energia again. The operation, the energy, the working of God. And the reason I wanted to bring that out, you kind of miss it in the English translations. Verse 9 is saying that the Antichrist is according to the energia of Satan. Verse 11 says, because of that, God's going to send an operation, an energia of delusion. And the importance of saying it that way is simply this. The energy, the operation of Satan is working side by side with the energy or operation of God at this point. So that Satan is bringing about deception. God is bringing about delusion. They're both working side by side, but God has an end goal in mind that's much different than the energia of Satan. So it's just a good little word study, and it kind of just is a good way to show this in this chapter by using that same Greek word, the same idea as Genesis 3:15, that these two operations, let's say, translate energia as operations, one of Satan, one of God, are both working side by side but which one's going to win out in the end?
Yeah, I often use that same term when looking at this power struggle between God and Satan. I use the word energy.
Energy.
It's a force. It's an energy. It's invisible in and of itself. But it plays out visibly to us through people, through events, through circumstances. It plays out on the earth through the material.
Yeah.
But it is raw, invisible force or energy. That's how I've always looked at it.
And these two energy forces have clashed time and time and time again.
Yes.
As we've said throughout this, often it looks like the energy force of evil is dominant, is in control. But in the end, that stone made without hands. It's interesting. It doesn't say in Daniel 2 it's going to strike it at the head, because in that image that's the first of many more empires.
Mm-hmm.
So it strikes it at his feet,
mm-hmm.
and the whole image comes crumbling down. But in another sense, it does strike it at its head, because
mm-hmm.
it's a death blow to the head,
to the whole thing,
just like Cain did to Abel.
The energy that we're talking about, we talked about movies and cartoons and nursery rhymes and all of this, even down to our day, the action heroes or action, the figures, trying to think of what they're called, Marvel heroes or something like that. They all have an energy force. They all have a specific energy or weapon that they have all been given. So even that concept of they're not just mere people or human figures, they're human figures with an energy force to accomplish their will. And so we see this whole idea of good versus evil played out in the scriptures. Man has borrowed that theme or that concept and has brought it to stage, brought it to the theater, brought it to children's books, but we can't escape it. It's just the knowledge we've been given of good and evil, and where we take it and what we do with it is going to be, it'll determine our own personal destiny.
Yes, it will. Now, I'm going to show you something to let everyone know I still live in the 20th century. I haven't quite made it in the 21st century yet, because I know most everybody use sword. There's logos software. There's all kinds of software and electronic programs out there that you can look this up easily. I use Bible Hub on my computer and other programs. So it's not like I never do it, but a lot of times, because I know myself, if I start looking all that stuff up online, 30 minutes can pass, and if I'm not careful. Whereas if I just grab my Englishman's Greek Concordance,
there you go,
1 foot away from me, and open it up to number 1753, energia, and it's used 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times in the New Testament. All of them by Paul. Paul loved this word. He loved that idea of energy force. And 2 Thessalonians 2:9 is translated after the working of Satan. And 2:11 is translated as strong delusion. But it's not the word for strong normally translated as strong in the New Testament. It's the word energia. And so the Englishman's Greek Concordance has in parentheses literally a working of error, a working or an outworking or energy force. And so a lot of times I just pick up this Greek Concordance, English Greek Concordance, and look it up real quick, and it lists all the verses right there. And then I'm back into my studies right away. Whereas if I do it online, maybe it's just me. But if I'm not careful, 30 minutes will pass because I'm chasing different rabbits and looking at different things. And it's recommending I go to this different source. And sometimes that's helpful, but sometimes you just want a real quick answer.
Yep.
And so I still have my books lined up on my desk. I know which ones to grab. And in 30 seconds, I can look it up and have my answer instead of fumbling around on the computer.
Well, you and I go back to where before all this took place, and all we had was our library, books we accumulated.
Yeah.
So I have that exact
Yeah.
same book, and yeah, it's just electronics have their place, but you're
You
right, they
think it
can
should
become a
speed up
trap.
your research, but
Yeah, or
yeah,
slow you
you
down,
think it should
depending.
speed up your research, and used correctly, it can, but other times it slows it down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, totally on board with that idea, bro.
Anyway, to close out this whole session today for everyone, it's just a way to encourage you to look at the Bible as recurring or reoccurring themes that repeat themselves over and over and over again. It's just a good way to study the Bible, kind of what we did today. And there's a lot more verses we could have read, examples and prophecies of antichrist and all that, but just to encourage you to see these interweaving themes working themselves out through the Bible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Anyway, that's all I got.
All right. Well, very good. I hope our viewers enjoyed that as much as I did. I got a front row seat, Brother Rick.
Well, I didn't say this in the beginning, but because of the subject, I didn't wear a nice collared shirt like you did. I purposely chose out this red, because it is interesting how red is often associated with Satan, with evil, wickedness, sin, but it's also connected to the blood of Christ.
Yes, it is.
Which takes care of sin.
Yes.
So I'll just be kind of silly and wear something bright red. Kind of fits the theme of the session today. So,
well, his garment is going to be splattered in red when he returns.
With
the blood of
Bozrah.
The blood of his enemies. Yes.
Blood of his enemies. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
His vestures dipped in blood.
Mm-hmm.
His name is called the Word of God.
Yes.
Revelation 18.
Yeah. Well, I said splattered, but the word is baptizo, isn't it? It's dipped.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's going to be a bloody mess, isn't it?
A bloody mess. Yes. We're on the right team, brother.
As we talked about last session, then comes the triumphal entry.
Yes.
Him leading the way into the city of the great king.
Mm-hmm.
He's going to walk into that city. He's going to prove you only think you could overcome Genesis 3:15.
Mm-hmm.
But here's the end of the story.
Yes. Yes. Amen. Well, that concludes session number 70. Very 70. Appropriate. You brought in the idea of 70 as well. So that was really good, brother.
Fit it in there somehow.
You did. Yes, yes. And thank you to our audience for watching. And we are up to 107 subscribers. So thank you for that.
We do ask, as always, that you share this with others, maybe even share the link on your social media pages, Facebook and other places, and email some of your friends and share the link with them, and recommend to them that they give us a watch. Mm-hmm. They may actually enjoy a few of these sessions and learn a thing or two, or at least show them how far off we are.
Yes, yes. Well, I know I enjoy it. So thank you, Brother Rick. We'll look
forward to we'll see where the next 70 sessions take us.
Yes, yes. So I guess that behooves us to stay healthy, doesn't it, then? So
thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.